Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Thanks to each of you for being here. Spectrum, as we know, is a limited resource. There's only so much of it that exists around us in our known universe. And so, as a result, we have to figure out ways to use it efficiently. Fortunately, we can find ways of doing that because as technology develops, our capacity to utilize existing spectrum is also enhanced. But I think it's clear from our testimony that we've received today that mid-band spectrum holds exceptional promise. That'll be useful not only for the development of 5G networks, but also for the development of technology generally moving forward. Mr. Bergman, I'll start with you. Off the top of your hand, can you tell us about how much mid-band spectrum you estimate the federal government has control of or access to, as compared to non-federal uses, including both licensed and non-licensed use?
Thank you, Senator, for your attention to mid-band spectrum. It's absolutely critical to our 5G future. I'll go a little bit off the top of my head with my estimate on federal spectrum, but it is multiple gigahertz of spectrum in that sort of critical 3 to 7 gigahertz band. And one of our challenges is that we have a severe national deficit when it comes to mid-band spectrum for the commercial license industry. We have 0 megahertz in that range today. We're on track to have 70 megahertz with the 3.5 auction that will happen next year. That is shared spectrum, and it's subject to very, very low power levels. And that's part of the reason that we're so supportive of this committee's focus on the 3.7 gigahertz band, the lower 3 gigahertz band, and we'd love to explore the opportunities for taking a balanced approach to the 6 gigahertz band and exploring some of that for license use as well, too.
Well, that is a lot of spectrum, a lot that the government has control over. It's interesting, though, federal agencies have very little incentive to share spectrum or to make it available for commercial use or any other competing use than that over which they have jurisdiction to make it available and to thereby make sure that it's used efficiently. The only way that we've achieved the efficiencies that we have is through market competition, and yet within the government-controlled spectrum, those things are absent. Do you think that the lack of market-based allocation means that we have greater spectrum inefficiencies within our federal allocations, greater inefficiencies than we would otherwise have?
Senator, I think you're exactly right. You put your finger on one of the biggest challenges is how to drive greater efficiencies in government use of spectrum. In the commercial sector, we have competition driving efficiency. U.S. wireless carriers have increased their efficiency 42 times since 2010. And the key challenge is how do you drive greater efficiency with federal use? We know that when we do that, we can actually free up spectrum for commercial wireless use, and we can deploy more advanced systems for federal government missions as well, too.
So is there room for reform?
We think there is.
Ms. Brown, how about you? Do you think there's room for reform in this area? And if so, what should we do?
Absolutely. I think there's plenty of room for reform. Among other things, I sit on the Commerce Department Spectrum Management Advisory Committee, and one of the issues we are wrestling with this year is just that problem. We have a system in the United States where we have FCC looking at commercial and trying to make that the most efficient use case, and then we have the federal agencies coordinating with NTIA, and it's really set up a world of two fiefdoms that it's very difficult to penetrate. So we're looking at the question of, is there a different governance model that the committee could recommend to NTIA that in turn could be recommended out to the larger policy committee? It's a critical question.
I know of one such solution, and this is why I've introduced something called the Government Spectrum Valuation Act. The bill does not transition any federal spectrum. It rather would require NTIA to estimate the value of the federal spectrum allocations between 3 kilohertz and 95 gigahertz. Providing for evaluation in this range and giving us access to this kind of crucial data would, I think, be helpful. And it'd be vital to give us in Congress as policymakers the ability to understand and make more informed decisions in this area. Ms. Brown, do you think this kind of data, this kind of information that would be produced through legislation like this would be helpful?
Absolutely. I think that would be a great contribution to understanding how we're using spectrum today to have that data. I think there's lots of data we don't have. We don't have data about how federal systems are going to evolve over time, the kinds of technologies that set of vendors is going to be developing in the future. We don't have any way to have a coherent conversation around is the federal spectrum being used efficiently? Do we have enough to serve the important missions of the executive branch agencies, while at the same time ensuring that we maximize the opportunity on the commercial side to have 5G and unlicensed technologies available to American consumers and businesses. So I think your bill is an important piece. I think there's lots of other data we need as well.
Thank you, and I look forward to learning more from you about the other kinds of data that would be helpful there, and I appreciated your answers. Part of what this reminds us of is, look, a certain amount of spectrum is, of course, necessary for government agencies. There's a valid use for it. Mm-hmm. Governments don't have access to the same data points as a market economy does. A market economy is kind of like its own nervous system. It sends its own signals. It gathers its own data. Governments are not that way. They never can be. We can't pretend otherwise, but we can gather some data points so as to give us at least the ability to make things more efficient. Thank you very much for your answers. I see my time's expired.
It's a good discussion. I think a new model is in order. It's time to initiate some of these reforms, so we'll look forward to talking with the senator from Utah about his bill.